Welcome back to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Karlan, along with Joe Bankman. And Joe, before the break, we were talking to Kathryne Young, who's a sociologist, about her book, How to Be Happy, sort of, in law school. And what did you think was the thing you liked best about the book?
Well, I liked so much of the book, but what resonated for me the most was a chapter of Katie's on what I'd consider emotion regulation. What I try to tell students is, look, have a goal for the next 3 years, and this could be anyone's goal, of dealing with hard emotional issues in a way that works for you. And that could give you grounding. Maybe law school isn't going great, but you can make progress in your goal. And one of the techniques Katie mentioned was mindfulness. You can look it up on the web. There's a million good guides to it. It's all about living in the present. When we're anxious, we're worried about the future. We're living in the future. When we're depressed, we regret our past. Mindfulness teaches how to live in and enjoy the present, and that would be a good goal for anybody to pick up.
Yeah, I mean, I thought Katie's book was just tremendous, but you must have thought it tremendous in a slightly different way, because in addition to being a law professor who writes and teaches about tax and tax policy, you're also a practicing clinical psychologist. And you've taken some of the ideas that Katie is writing about and have used those kinds of ideas in trying to teach law students how to emotionally regulate themselves, both while they're in law school and more broadly in life. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about some of those techniques which our listeners might find helpful in their lives, whether they're in law school now or they're a practicing lawyer or they never want to have any contact with lawyers or law students at all.
Sure. It's a great question, Pam. We've talked about one briefly, mindfulness. There's another kind of technique which is just called get a lot of exercise. We know that exercise is like a magic pill we carry in our back pocket and don't use. Proven short-term and long-term good effects on emotional health. I'm going to pick up on one that Katie mentioned, maybe for the third time, which is how do you frame things in your mind? When you interpret the world, are you someone that says catastrophe is about to happen, or are you and that I'm terrible, or are you someone that says I'm not so bad? And one technique that Katie mentioned is what would you tell a friend? So if you think catastrophe is about to happen to yourself and that you're worthless, imagine you're your best friend and think, what would you tell someone like you?
Right. Would you tell yourself you're probably never going to get a job and you aren't all that good at this anyway? No.
Because it's not even true. Some of us simply catastrophize. So getting into that habit, it's called cognitive reframing. If our listeners wanted to kind of look it up for themselves, it can be incredibly useful.
You know, one question that I asked these students that I surveyed was, what's the time in the last week when you were the happiest? And I asked alums this question too. And what struck me about the answers was how small these moments were that people mentioned. So they said things like throwing the ball for my dog or making a peanut butter sandwich while listening to music. And it was almost like, you know, kind of a reverse way into mindfulness. They found these moments where they were connecting with something at the core of themselves, or where they were allowed to be very, very present in what they were doing.
And do you think there's less of that now because people are so often connected to devices rather than living in the present, in the physical present, they're living in some other world?
Well, I think that's part of it. And I think for some people, it's really hard to enjoy those small pleasures. And if we're going to jump in maybe to the unhappy lawyers around us, one of my first bits of advice is make sure you have those small pleasures in your day. You know, a lot of unhappy lawyers and unhappy people in other professions have a kind of all or nothing black and white view of the world, and they might think, my life really sucks. What I should do is quit this job and become a high school teacher in a small town. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe that's the right thing.
Do you end up as Walter White if you do that?
That's the next step if you don't like being a high school teacher.
Become a large-scale drug dealer.
He was in a medium-sized city. But in any event,
you should see what happens after that.
Yeah.
What I tell them is let's start smaller. Let's start with your non-work life and think of things that might make that better. And if I could do this kind of hokey little exercise for us all, suppose we all took just 20 seconds and thought about a small pleasure we could give ourselves this week.
Well, we don't want to have dead air time while we think about that. So should I be singing some Broadway tune while we do the 20 seconds or like the dit and on Jeopardy?
I think the 20 seconds is now up.
Yeah, I think I've consumed that time.
But it's a good exercise because my experience, most people have an answer, but they don't do it. And so starting small is one approach for the practicing lawyer.
So this is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with Kathryne Young, a sociologist, about her book, How to Be Happy, Sort of, in Law School, and also about how to be happy for the rest of us, more than sort of, in life. Joe?
Well, I mentioned a minute ago starting small in your outside life. Do some exercise, listen to music. Food is very important to us. Our sense of smell and taste are key. Go there if that's what does it for you. But you can also start small in your job. Even if you don't like your job, there's probably parts of it you like more than other parts. Be proactive. Get more of that. It can be you can lead yourself through small incremental steps to a job you really like.
That's definitely true, and it relates to something else that I talked about in the book, and that you talk about on your wellness podcast, Joe. Sometimes, which is the idea of beginner's mind, and the idea of cultivating this beginner's mindset, this ability to kind of see things with new eyes. One piece of advice that I would give to anyone kind of unhappy in what they're doing or who wants to cultivate beginner's mind is to start something new that you probably won't be good at, that you don't really care if you're good at, that you have to pay close attention to what you're doing. I did this myself, starting as a professor now a little over 2 years ago. I decided, you know what? Pottery has never worked for me. Me and pottery just don't get along. So I decided, you know what? I'm going to try pottery. I'm going to try it out. And, the end of this, 2 years later is not, and now I'm a really good potter. The answer is, I make like 5-pound tiny bowls that are terrible. But it taught me, it really helped my teaching and it really helped my writing because it allowed me to focus in the moment on what I was doing, something that was very low stakes, and that that I didn't see it as a reflection of who I was. It's a way of training your brain to think in a beginner's way.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with that. I've been taking Italian, and I'm terrible at it, but I love it. And the other thing it's done, which I think has been really helpful, is it reminds me how hard it is to learn something new, which gives me more patience with students who are learning something new, but also makes me feel more of a sense of kind of pride and craft in the things I do well. Because I think, these things are hard to do as well. And I think things like that are mountain biking. I'm still a terrible descender. I still walk down a lot of hills because I'm afraid to do it. But it does force you to be in that moment. You're not thinking about anything else because if you think about anything else, you'll crash. Right?
And another, I love the idea, and I bet our listeners are thinking about things that maybe they could do that's different, how fun that could be. It also gets us involved with what you talk about, Katie, as a growth mindset. When you take something new like pottery, you're going to be bad at it. You're not going to be so tough on yourself, usually. It's not true of everybody, unfortunately. And instead of trying to be a perfectionist, you can say, well, my only goal is to learn this. Nobody expects me, and I don't even expect myself to be good at this. And that kind of attitude can carry over to work. And what we know is that people with growth mindsets that are willing to say, I'm just going to try to learn this, actually do better than the rest of us.
And if you're thinking about talking to your friends about this, encouraging that idea in your friends is also really important. Saying to people, this is hard, but if you try, you can do it. That kind of idea of the growth mindset and the idea of grit turns out to be very effective in enabling people to do things that otherwise they might not be able to do.
Right, and that your inability to apprehend something instantly isn't a reflection of who you really are or your true intelligence. You're not there yet. Adding yet to the, to the end of things. I'm no good at this yet.
Yeah, I think that's right. We've talked about so many good ideas today. I love the growth mindset, and it's a way, by the way, of being able to deal with criticism, which is hard for people. If you think that criticism is judging your inner worth, it's hard. If you think, I just have to know how to make this kind of glaze, it's not so hard. Well, that's one of the tips. We've got mindfulness. We've got other parts of your book we didn't mention. For example, how to take a law school exam. I don't know if many of our listeners are in that position, but if you are, reason to get Katie's book. So, Katie, thank you so much for being on with us.
Oh, thank you both.
Yes, thank you. And thanks to our listeners for joining us on Stanford Legal here on Sirius XM Insight 121.